kings in his hands, who has numbered every grain of sand. Kings and nations tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has given counsel to the Lord? Who can question any of his word? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deeds? Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has felt the nails upon his hands, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humble to the grave, Jesus Savior, risen now to reign. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our
You were probably watching the news this past week with the hurricane that was coming up and slammed into Florida, as well as sweeping around over into the Carolinas there. And whenever those storms are out there in the ocean and they start tracking them, they begin to issue a series of warnings, and they try to predict where the storm is going to strike and what people need to do in preparation for the storm. And typically with a hurricane coming through like that, they'll batten down the hatches, they'll put up the plywood, get the batteries, the water, have some extra food, get gasoline, things like that. If you're going to be in the eye or in the pathway of a very serious storm, often there's an evacuation that needs to take shape. But you see all these warnings coming on the news, and you were watching them. I was seeing them. They just crop up, and they're preparing people for this oncoming hurricane. And this is something that we see not terribly often, but it happens. We do this here in Vermont just the same, not necessarily with hurricanes, but just with winter storms coming through. And it's on the horizon, and what happens? We go out and we get the bread and the eggs, and make sure you have enough gas for your snow blower, and the snow tires are on, and you're ready to hunker down with a cord of wood in the garage, and you're good to go. And we prepare for these things. And Joel chapter 2 is a preparation for a coming storm. Joel chapter 2 is setting the stage, and Joel wants his audience, not just his ancient audience, but the contemporary audience, which is us today, to heed this warning that he is posting right here in the Scriptures. And he tells us here in Joel chapter 2, starting with verse 1, and we're going to read through the first 11 verses. It says this: "Blow a trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Surely it is near. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. As the dawn is spread over the mountains, so there's a great and mighty people. There's never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it, to the years of many generations. A fire consumes before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but a desolate wilderness behind them, and nothing at all escapes them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like war horses, so they run, with a noise as of chariots. They leap on the tops of mountains, like crackling of a flame, of a fire consuming the stubble, like a mighty people arranged for battle. Before them the people are in anguish, all faces turn pale. They run like mighty men. They climb the wall like soldiers, and they each march in line, nor do they deviate from their paths. They do not crowd each other. They march everyone in his path. When they burst through the defenses, they do not break ranks. They rush on the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter through the windows like a thief. Before them the earth quakes. The heavens tremble. The sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord utters his voice before his army. Surely his camp is very great. For strong is he who carries out his word. The day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome, and who can endure it?" We'll stop right there. We have the alarm, we have the storm, and then we have a challenge. And this is really sort of like a sandwich. We have this initial alarm at the very beginning in the first verse. We have this challenge at the end. And then in between we have this description of the storm, the flood, if you would, that's coming in, that's going to strike. And we open here with this warning. It's similar to what we see in Ezekiel's passage, and that's why we looked at Ezekiel 33, to take a peek here at the fact that there's going to be times when God would sound an alarm, would want to warn people about things. And that happened by way of a trumpet. And we have a picture here of the shofar, and there's a fellow blowing into a shofar. It's a ram's horn, and they would use trumpets in ancient Israel for a variety of reasons, for festivities and religious occasions and the like. And every once in a while they would sound the shofar, this ram's horn, as an alarm to warn people that something is coming. This is how they communicated. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't post things on YouTube. You didn't go and turn on the evening news to figure out what was going on. When you heard this thing blasting, you knew that there was something up. And this is precisely what's taking shape here. Joel is saying, sound the alarm, blow the shofar, let everybody know, let everybody be warned that something is coming. And he uses the word alarm here because he wants them to know that this isn't for some happy occasion here. This isn't Uncle David's birthday and we're all getting together here for some cake and coffee. This is to let everybody know you got to get ready. And when he says that, he wants them to tremble. And he uses that word to shake, to quake. There's an old spiritual hymn we sing around Easter. It's one of my favorites. We sing it every Good Friday. It says this: "Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, to shake, to stop, to stand in awe." We were living in Texas, and it was springtime. It was a beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky. And off on the horizon, it was at the end of the day, we saw this black front coming in. The entire horizon was just pitch black. And as that front was coming closer and closer, the wind starts to howl, the rain starts to fly. You saw things blowing all over the place. There was sleet, there was hail, there was all sorts of stuff. And suddenly it got so violent because these storms would come down from the plains. They would come barreling down out of Canada, these fronts, and they would clash with the warm air coming off of the Gulf. And you'd have this violent, tumultuous downpour that would follow, and anything that wasn't nailed down was flying across the road. It was almost like like in The Wizard of Oz, when you saw Mrs. Gulch just getting on the little bike there, just flying through. It was kind of akin to that. It was one of these scenes where boxes and garbage cans and chairs and things, poles were snapping, wires were flapping around. You saw the sparks everywhere, and it was this violent storm that came through, and it was just awesome to look at. And then it stopped. And everything grew still. And it was quiet. And the sky went from black to mud brown. The entire sky, just everything was like that color of mud. And it was still. And that's what's terrifying. Because that is the condition for a tornado. When everything is still and quiet and the sky turns brown, you begin to listen for the train. Because at any moment, that thing could hit and it's like a monster. Uncontrollable, unpredictable, destructive. And when you live in the plains, and you see that on the horizon, it's terrifying. And you stop and you stand in awe at what you see. Ecclesiastes says this: "For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather, fear God." The NIV translates this: "Stand in awe of God." When the trumpet is blown, when the warning is issued, when God speaks up and says, pay attention, God's people need to tremble when he sounds an alarm. Point number one. They needed to tremble and think about the implications of what was to come. The storm, verses 11 on. There's this description. He says it's what? The day of the Lord. And we began to explore that last week. The day of the Lord we found was perhaps a single day, something like with Pharaoh, whereby in one fell swoop on one day, God would pour judgment and justice upon someone or a group of people that were violating his law and his word. And we see that when Moses crossed and the children of Israel the sea, and Pharaoh and his army chased after them, wham, and it was over in just a single day. The day of the Lord could be a single event. The day of the Lord could be a series of events, a judgment that may come upon a nation, or a group of people who have been disobedient. We also know that the day of the Lord could also be an era, more than just a few events, but a whole period of time, pointing us really toward the end times or eschatology when Christ returns. So we find here a single day, a couple of events, or an entire era constitutes the day of the Lord, but it always involves the notion of God rendering justice and judgment upon people, whether it be a nation, individuals, perhaps the entire world. And what we find here in this description of this day of the Lord mentions a few very powerful images: darkness, gloom, invasion, pain, struggle, suffering. It's very hard to digest when you get down to it. You see this picture, and many scholars have wondered, well, what is this? We find in the beginning of Joel, there's this locust invasion, and they know that part of the day of the Lord is going to involve these little bugs that are going to come in there, and they're going to wipe them out economically. They're going to eat every grape, every tree, every vine, every fig, every piece of wheat out there. Everything is going to get consumed, so they're going to face a difficult economic calamity. They know that that's part of the day of the Lord. This picture here goes even further, and scholars have debated, what could this be? First off, could be locusts. It could be a literal locust army coming in, and it's very descriptive and akin to something like this. It also could be a literal army that marches in, rank and file, and invades the land. It also can be a spiritual army, pointing us to the day of the Lord in the end times. And we see a portrait of that in Revelation. Revelation 9, 1 through 11 says this. It paints a picture of an army. Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth, and the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and power was given them, as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not permitted to kill anyone, but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And in those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, and death flees from them. The appearance of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle. And on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots of many horses rushing to battle. They have tails like scorpions, and stings in their tails is their power to hurt men for 5 months. They have as a king over them the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek his name is Apollyon. And we have this description here in the eschaton during the end times. And most scholars believe that this is a picture of a demonic army being released from the abyss to torment and attack people here on planet Earth. Locusts, a literal army, a spiritual army. The day of the Lord, because it has such a broad definition to it, I believe all three are being described here in Joel chapter 2. It's a horrible scene of destruction, an unstoppable force, terror and anguish. Some of you understand that anguish. It tells us here that there would be this sense of pain that would come upon people. If you've ever given birth, that is the very word that is used in Hebrew, the pain of labor that suddenly would come upon a woman who is pregnant. That sudden burst of pain is exactly what Joel is describing here in this passage. What's unique about all this is what is said at the very end. It says, verse 11, the Lord thunders at the head of his army. Even though this is a destructive force, even though this is a force that seems to be completely unstoppable, even though this is a force that brings utter terror to those who are watching and experiencing it, it tells us here that God reigns over this group. And that's the good news. That no matter whether it is a literal army a locust army, a spiritual army, whatever the case may be. This horrible storm that we read about, that sends chills up and down the spine as you consider the implications of it, is a force that is under the reign of a sovereign God. We were singing before that we were standing on the promises of God. And you may have read a few books, and perhaps you've done a couple of Bible studies. I've done a few of these studies. And we like to look at the promises of God in the Bible, don't we? Because there's some really good promises. He promises to what? Never leave us or forsake us. So we think, oh, that's awesome. I need to hang on to that one. And he promises that he will guide us and direct us if we seek for wisdom. He promises to help us through temptation. He promises to rescue us. He promises to give us, all that we need according to his glorious riches in Christ. There's all these wonderful promises, whether it be temptations or wrestling with all these, fears and the like. And we think to ourselves, oh, this is fantastic. I'm going to stand on these promises because there's such blessing that comes from them. Well, I want to share with you one of the promises of God. In this world, you will have trouble. Whoops, there it is. That's a promise from God. And all God's people rose up and said what? Oh, no, not me. That's a promise right from Jesus. He says, you're going to have trouble in this world. And he warns us over and over again that maybe we are not going to be subject to a literal invasion of soldiers. We may not have locusts knocking on our front door. We may not be around during the eschaton, during the end times, and have to confront some of these other things. We may be free from all this, but we are going to have trouble. And I don't care what era and age you live in, whether we are here for the day of the Lord or not, we are going to face trials and tribulations, and many of you are going through them right now. And you may feel like there's an army that's invaded into your life. You may feel like you have this pressure that's coming upon you that's there like this mighty force. And the important point we need to extrapolate this and take away from this is this: that God reigns over rough times. He's still king. He's still on his throne. And he still has everything completely under control. So we find here that he's going to warn us. And we also find here that no matter what happens, no matter what era we live in, no matter how bad things may get, no matter how beat up you may feel you are, we have a God who reigns. And we stand on that. So what do? The challenge of Joel in the very, very end is this. He says, the day of the Lord is great, it is dreadful. And then he asks the question, who can endure it? Who can endure it? And that word for endure here is to comprehend, to wrap your mind around it, to understand it. I like to figure things out. I was one of those kids that when especially if I was told don't do something, I did it, And, don't play with the lawnmower. Well, guess who took apart the lawnmower, And, I was one of these people that I like to know how things work. And I like to know how my dishwasher works, so I take it apart. So I like to know how the lawn, I take things apart. I'm just one of those people that I like to know the mechanics of how things work. And there's certain things in this world you're never going to find out how it works. And that's what we find here. When it says who can endure, it's going to be who can comprehend, who can wrap their mind around what God is about to do through the trials and tribulations and these storms that we're facing in our lives. You're not always going to be able to wrap your head around it. The idea of endure also, it's an ambiguous word in Hebrew. It carries with it the idea of who can prevail when they're ill. Who could rise up when you're feeling sick? Who could plow through the storm of a physical malady? And really, it's a rhetorical question, and the answer is no one, sort of. No one on their own can do this. But let's bring it right back to the beginning of the trembling. What if we stop for a moment and we truly tremble before the Lord? What if we stop for a moment, we listen to the alarm? What if we stop for a moment, we heed what God has to say? What if we stop for a moment and say, wait a minute, something's going on here. We're getting these warning lights being flashed at us, and we begin to have a healthy understanding of what it means to fear God. We were talking about this in Sunday school class. What does it mean to fear the Lord? Now, there's two types of fear in the Bible. We have anxiety, which we have to avoid, which is very, very dangerous, and that could tear you apart. And we have lots of scriptures that tell us, do not be afraid, do not worry, etc. Do not be anxious for anything. And there's a lot of that, but there's also another side to fear, and we find that there is a healthy fear in fearing God. And it tells us here, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. This is a good fear. It's a reverence. It's a respect. It's a recognition of the awesome power of a holy God, a sovereign God. And when that begins to take root in our hearts, it tells us in Job, and he said to him, behold, the fear of the Lord is that wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. And when that begins to occur, when we have a healthy understanding of who we are as people, rather tiny, rebellious and sinful, and God who is holy and just and powerful and reigning over his creation, when we have that proper perspective, then we could live a life of humility, a life of trust, a life of faith. And that's why it tells us in Isaiah 27:9, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. The fear of the Lord begins to cultivate that inner understanding of our need to walk by faith. We find faith in the Bible is defined as the hope of things that we do not see, the evidence that is out there that is not perceived by the naked eye. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. The righteous will live by faith. Faith is what moves the mountains. You don't need a lot of faith, you just need a little bit of it. A mustard seed is all that it takes. And that faith, when put into practice, is what enables us to walk in a sense of victory. And this is where the hope comes into play. The storms are on the horizon. We're going to be facing all sorts of trials and tribulations. God is sitting on his throne. He's got this whole mess under control. And what we need to be doing here, if we're going to rise up and accept this challenge, because we can't endure it on our own, is that we've got to turn to him, realize his power, realize his strength, realize our own inability. And when that fear takes root and we have that healthy understanding of who he is, it is then we stand firm on his promises. And we can stand firm through the storms. The rest of the verse that Jesus gives us in John 16:33 says, these things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. Notice, where does the peace come from? It comes from Jesus. It doesn't come from me. It doesn't come from us. It doesn't come from my works. It doesn't come from my brains. It doesn't come from my bank account. It doesn't come from anything else like that. It comes from who? It comes from Christ. In me you will have peace. In this world you will have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. And that is good news, because our third point is simply this: Jesus grants peace in the storm. But you got to believe. A guy by the name of John Yates. His parents came over from England. His father was a shoemaker, lived in New York State. John had a rough start when he headed into life. He was just a little guy, and he was on the top of a stone stairwell, and he fell down a flight of steps. They're all made out of stone, and he cracked his skull open. He was unconscious for quite some time. They did not know he was going to live. It took him several weeks to recover from this nasty head injury. Miraculously enough, he was able to walk and talk again. A couple of years later, John is on a boat with mom and dad. The boat gets hit by a wave, and this young guy gets thrown across the boat. He smashes his leg, he breaks his leg. They didn't think he was going to walk. First, they don't think he's going to live. Now they don't think he's going to walk. He survives that. A few years later, John Yates, he's working in a theater troupe. He's in a company of people. He's a stagehand. He's in the back there, and he's the guy that's got to lower and raise the curtains on those big bars in this theater. And they had a bunch of props for this play, and one of the props was this long knife. And they had this big knife, and they dulled the knife because they didn't want anybody to get hurt. So they ground the knife down so it wasn't sharp or pointed, didn't have any edge to it at all. And they had this knife, and John is there working the curtain, and he pulls the curtain up, and suddenly it comes crashing down, and it hits him, and he falls on top of the knife, and the knife sticks him in the lungs, and he's in the hospital for 3 weeks. They didn't think he was going to live that either. And somehow or another, he walks away out of the hospital a month later. John Yates goes out and he gets married. He has a wife and a couple kids. In the course of 1 week, he loses both of his children and his wife to diphtheria. But it was John Yates who wrote the song, "Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world." How did that young guy go through injuries and accidents and losses? How did he face the storms of life that you and I are facing today? He heard the alarm, he responded to God's sovereign grace, and he placed his faith in the one who could carry him through. And he penned the words of the song we're about to sing in about 2 seconds. So let's take a moment to pray.